Good evening, folks. I'm Al Huey, along with my partner Robert Eierman, and our special guest tonight again is City Attorney Keith Lemieux.
Hi.
Keith, thanks for joining us.
Thank you,
appreciate
Keith.
it.
Thanks for having me
Appreciate
back.
it. You bet.
We've been talking about water a lot here on our show, and we understand you're in the negotiation process for a JPA for the city on the ground, the GSA.
That's correct.
Okay. And we can't talk too much about that because he is in the middle of negotiations, so we'll try to stay clear of that. But if we get there, you'll put the flag up.
I'll put the flag up. That's
okay. Off the air, I was asking if you knew anything about what are the standards for classifying a ground basin in critical overdraft, and you said you really didn't know for sure, but
You know, it's a hydrological determination that would have to be made by technical experts.
and the reason I bring it up, I've been getting information that we have some wells in our district, water district, or not necessarily the water district,
in the basin.
in the basin,
Not
that are
belonging-
not in decline, they are inclining. And you were saying that that's not unusual. You saw something
Yeah,
like
well,
that?
it's so I've gotten sort of an education on this because of the Antelope Valley groundwater adjudication that we did for the last 15 years, and then before that the Santa Maria Basin. And when you're talking about an overdraft, you're talking about declining conditions over a period of years.
Which is
so
what we're arguing here.
So the trend line kind of goes down over time. It doesn't mean that it's going down every year. In fact, it might go up some years. It just means the overall trend is down. And it doesn't mean that the trend is down everywhere in a basin. As a matter of fact, because of localized hydrological conditions, certain parts of the basin could maybe not be affected apparently at all. Maybe because there's a ridge of hard rock that kind of keeps the water perched there, or in some areas that's where the water happens to recharge the most, so the wells don't seem to be affected, because that's really where all the water for the basin first comes in. So it wouldn't surprise me to learn that a heavily overdrafted basin could have areas where well levels were either staying the same or going up. Well levels by themselves don't tell the whole story.
But your experience is it's not justification for revisiting a critically overdraft basin and reclassifying it?
Well, if they're talking about critically, I haven't studied the work done in this particular basin, but I can tell you that when you're talking about an overdrafted basin, you're talking about a condition that's studied over years. So what that means is you're not looking at the data from any one year or from any one well. You're looking at data from a whole, let's say, 10-year, 20-year, 30-year span. And so obviously each piece of data in each individual well is an important data point, but it's just one data point. So one well going up may not tell you much, or may tell you a lot. You know, you got to look at what the rest of the basin is doing.
And you were mentioning that you were involved with an adjudication down in Mojave?
Down in the Antelope Valley.
Antelope Valley. And now that we have these GSAs that have been declared that have to be set up by the state, and we've been in this drought, there's a high probability there will be more potential for adjudication across the state. One could...
Potentially. I mean, I think the purpose of the law was supposed to be to avoid that.
Right, but
you know,
I would be one to think that there's a high probability that we'll have more adjudication.
that would not, you would not be alone in that opinion.
And when that happens, you're in Antelope Valley 15 years with not many adjudications of water going on. If we all of a sudden have an influx of those, a 15-year adjudication could go out 20, 25 years?
Well, they one of the things that they did last year to take that into consideration is they did pass new streamlined procedural rules for groundwater adjudications that are supposedly going to speed them up. However, that's the good news. The bad news is that those rules were basically modeled on some of the rules that the judge adopted for the Antelope Valley case, and it still took a long time to adjudicate that one. So, you know, it remains to be seen how much it really speeds it up.
Okay.
But yeah, they're long process. It's a situation where, in effect, literally every person who pumps water in a valley is essentially suing every other person or entity that pumps water in a valley, and that can be a lot of people. In the case of the Antelope Valley, it was more than 4,500 pumpers that were all in the soup, and then we had a bunch of non-pumpers. I think 30,000 non-pumping.
So they didn't really have an ag versus non-ag issue down there.
They did, but they had an ag versus they also had an ag versus quarry problem, and a this kind of public entity versus that kind of public entity problem, and so there were definitely camps, but those camps kind of changed depending on the issues. Sometimes parties came together that were opposed. And the feds were also involved.
Oh, was going to be my next question. Was the Edwards Air Force Base involved?
The Air Force was very involved in the adjudication. Yeah.
Okay.
Which is the same thing we would possibly expect here with an adjudication in this water basin.
Yeah, that's right.
The Navy could get involved easily.
Yeah, I'm not saying that they would, but I'm just saying
this basin's a lot smaller, both geographically and in terms of the amount of users, as far as I know. I haven't done a careful study, but just looking at it, it seems to be the case. There are much fewer, there aren't as many public entities involved. That's sort of the good news. The bad news is, in terms of getting new water into the basin, there's not as many options as there is down south also. So the potential remedies are fewer that I can see.
Okay.
So that will make it a little tougher in some respects. So it'll be easier in the sense there's less parties, but harder because
we've got, like I said, some wells that are inclining, some that are smaller wells. Now the ones that are inclining are the big ag wells. The smaller private wells seem to be the ones that have an issue, and we'll talk about that when we come back. We got to take a break, so join us on the other side of the break when we'll continue the discussion here with City Attorney Keith Lemieux.
And welcome back to Ridgecrest Talk, the Thursday evening edition. I'm Robert Eierman, along with Al Huey, and our special guest tonight is City Attorney Keith Lemieux. And believe it or not, we're talking about water. Imagine that.
As I say before we went to break, at least from our perception of when we got into this issue of the water here, it seemed to be private well owners and the water district and the Navy kind of combining forces against ag.
Okay.
One issue that I have, and I don't, again, you're not a water specialist, but it seems to
I am a water specialist.
Oh, you are? Okay. We have the private well owners out there off of Brown Road, for the most part, are clumped together in a relatively small area, where ag is spread out all over Inyokern. And you have the Kona Depression, I'm sure you're familiar with. And we've talked to private well owners. Well, it was a community well. There was like, what, five people on it,
yeah,
that had issues with their well. Okay, serious decline. New property owner came in where that well was, and that property owner re-drilled it, went deeper, put in new casings rather than the old steel casings that were collapsing. And they told us since they did that change, they have little drop, if any, and there's on one side is a pistachio farm, and on the other side is a hayfield, commercial. So, a lot of it depends on the well that these people have, and the majority of them, I would think, are pretty old wells, probably not more than three 350 feet wells.
Right. Yeah.
And these ag wells, minimum are 1,000. Some of them are down 2,000 feet. Larger casings, and it just seems like we're comparing apples to oranges. You know what I'm saying?
Well, if you're talking about, I mean, well interference issues where you're talking about a cone of depression, that's possible, and that can happen obviously in a basin that's fine. You don't need an overdraft to cause a cone of depression from overpumping and affect somebody else's well. That's sort of a separate issue. Although it can be obviously exacerbated by an overall overdraft condition. As far as your point is that if you're drilling deeper, you find water. Is that?
The ag wells are showing less of a drop
Yeah.
than these private well owners. There are some saying 1.5 foot, 2 foot a year drop. Now those are what, 8-inch,
6-inch wells.
6-inch wells, and these ag wells are
16.
18-inch wells.
Yes.
So if you're talking about an overdraft, you're comparing the input of water into the basin and the output being drawn out of the basin. And if the output's greater than the input, you have an overdraft. As far as what the effect of that might be on a particular well, obviously that's determined, as you pointed out, by the depth of the well and the hydrology around the well and the geological conditions around the well. And so, you really need a technical expert to explain maybe a difference between two wells.
Well, and there's nothing that you can say about it, but it seems like the ag wells were not getting consideration for all the data they had, but the private well owners that were crying that, I'm going to run out of water here. I'm at 260 feet. I got a 300-foot well. I'm dropping 1.5 foot a year here.
Well, I don't know what to tell you about that.
Yeah, I mean, but they got, all these other wells around them, small wells.
Mm-hmm. Let me see if I can draw it together. If we consider the basin a bathtub, mm-hmm. and each well is a straw pulling mm-hmm. water out, and with the amount of water that's being pulled out versus the depth of the bathtub, mm-hmm. and you analyze it and you say, I'm pulling out 29,000 acre feet a year, and at that rate my bathtub will only last 600 years. But I am in continual overdraft because there's nothing coming in. If you talk to people, they'll say that there is no, quote, current water coming into the basin. The water that's coming into the basin is doing that after it's made a 500, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 year journey to get back to the basin. But my point is if you have 500, 600, 1,500 years of water at the current rate that you're using it, why is the government worried? Why are we worried?
Well, so you're saying, okay, maybe there's an overdraft, but it's still going to take a long time for us to draw all that water down.
But there's definitely an overdraft.
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons for that. There's a reason, for example, that the Air Force got involved down south, and that was that because of the overdraft and drawing down of water. Now, they weren't running out of water, as you pointed out. They were maybe going deeper and finding older water, but they still had water. But the reason the Air Force got involved and was concerned was something called land subsidence. The runway started compacting down. So one of the effects of drawing the water out of the ground is it can cause compression on certain sort of clay-type material soils.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And that caused them to not be able to use some of their runways. So there are other effects beyond simply not having the water that are adverse. We also recognize that once you start getting that kind of subsidence, you lose that amount of storage.
Yes.
In other words, you'll never store that water again.
Correct.
So as a result, it's considered to be sort of best practice to try to maintain a basin out of overdraft conditions if possible. in addition to, you mentioned the sort of math equation that goes into the overdraft, there's another factor too, which could be important in this valley in particular, and that is you also look at water that's being used and then applied on the ground, compare the recharge rate and the evapotranspiration rate. That's water that's retained back in the ground too.
Yes.
And as well as water that might be discharged, for example, from sewage.
Boy, I got to cut you off because we got.
Can you stick around for another segment, or you got to
How
run?
much time do we have?
Better run?
I think I better get going.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, join us on the other side of the break, and Robert and I will pick it up. Welcome back to Ridgecrest Talk, the Thursday night edition. Al Huey here, along with Robert Eierman, and our guest Keith Lemieux had to run. This is Wednesday night that we're actually recording the Thursday night show, so he had to get over to the city hall for the meeting.
One of the questions that I wanted to ask Keith, and you know, just as a thought provoker, but being an attorney, I wanted to have his input relative to the potential fines that the Department of Water Resources is threatening on the Indian Wells Valley Water District, and according to what Don Zadiba said, that could be like $137,000.
Yeah.
Fine, and it seems that could be any minute that they could do that. They may never do it. But the question I wanted to ask Keith is had there been any successful fighting of those or objection to those, and what would be the legal path to do that? But we didn't have time.
Right.
But I think that's pretty important. I mean, $137,000 fine to this district is pretty significant.
Oh, yeah.
I know there's been some other districts fined $60,000, $70,000, and
They're larger districts.
they're much larger districts, and they're ones that depend upon their water for their income, because their income is tourism, and they're going to tell DWR, here's your money, go away.
Right.
But we can't, I don't think, afford to do that.
Well, it's surprising to me, this data that I'm hearing about where we have wells on the incline. I remember what I was going to talk about a little bit. There's also data out there, you know, a lot of people believe we have this, like you said, a bathtub with no water coming in. It's just sitting there.
Using that as the worst case example.
But there's strong indication that we have rivers flowing through our basin.
I agree with that.
There's water data that shows that we have water movement. If we have water movement, that means we have water coming in
and water going
out.
Right. And one could argue, if that's the case, if you don't use it, it just goes out of the basin anyway.
Right.
So
could it be that we're really not in overdraft? It's wherever it's going is sucking us dry?
Well, that could be, but it's also
we need to plug it up, maybe.
Well, now here there's some people that are absolutely convinced that there's untapped water in this basin, or close to this basin, within gravity flow to provide to this basin, and although slight change, although we've been designated critical overdraft, and I don't know that there's any way to change that. So to try and look at the positive of that, that does open this basin up for monies that would not be available if we weren't in critical overdraft. I'm not saying that I'm glad that it is. I'm just saying that that is the silver lining of that cloud. And although we have to have the GSA formed quicker, and the plan has to have a shorter time frame on it.
But you know, that fine they're talking about, I don't know how many other areas of the state, when the state implemented this what was it, 20% conservation?
25%.
25%?
Right.
No, it couldn't have been that much.
Yeah, that was the governor's order, and then they distributed distributed
Yeah,
it
you're right.
around, and we won't have it.
And then I don't know how many of these other areas had already achieved, like we had achieved, around 20% reduction.
I don't think very many.
Yeah, we'd already done it on our own before the state had come in.
Yeah, and we got no credit for that.
Right. So
And also remember,
it seems a little unfair to get fined when you were ahead of the game trying to conserve.
well, not only that, it's unfair to the users of the Indian Wells Valley Water District, the non-ag users, although there might be some that get from Indian Wells Valley, but all of the big users got no reduction.
Yeah.
And we're an area that we depend upon water for our cooling. I mean,
Yeah, that's another thing.
we're also spoiled. I don't think any of us could go back to the 1920s and survive here.
Right, right.
So, and although
Camp out in your car, turn the AC on, I guess.
yeah, right.
But yeah, they don't consider, the fact that we need water for a good portion of the valley for cooling during the summer. So it's crazy the way some of these government entities look at things without really looking at them.
Yes,
If you know what I'm saying.
Yes, I know what you're saying.
They just make a blanket statement and it applies to everybody.
Right.
So, well, we're just about the end of the show. We're going to try to get Supervisor Mick Gleason on here as soon as we can. He's kind of been tied up lately, that he's now the chair of the County Board of Supervisors, but I've talked to his staffer here in Ridgecrest, and we're still going to try to get him over here and get him on, and we'll talk to him about the GSAs and what's going on.
I would also like to bring in Mayor Breeden.
And the mayor.
Yes, I'd like to talk with her.
Yeah, she made a comment evidently recently.
That's what I was going to bring up.
That we might only have 1 or 2 years of water. She didn't know.
Yeah,
But yeah, we'll have to show her some of this data where it shows we got 1,500 years. But anyway, that's going to do it for us tonight. Join us again here next week. Have a blessed evening, and we'll see you next week.